Let's talk about who Kajenga is. So Kajenga Wellness Project is a Black-led grassroots project designed to initiate supportive community resources for children, youth, adults, and families in the Durham region. We strive to build our community foundation, promote holistic teaching and education, and promote mental wellness and healing from trauma. So before we begin, we're going to get into our land acknowledgement. Kajenga Wellness Project acknowledges the land and people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations. We are thankful to be welcomed on these lands in friendship. The lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties and the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Great Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Petawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the Indigenous nations who have cared for Turtle Island, also called North America, from before the arrival of settler people until this day. Most importantly, we remember the history of these lands has been tainted by poor treatment and a lack of friendship with the First Nations who call them home. This history is something we are all affected by, as we are all treaty people in Canada. We all have a shared history to reflect on, and each of us is affected by this history in different ways. Our past defines our present, but if we move forward as friends and allies, then it does not have to define our future. Now, our African Canadian acknowledgement. As we begin, let's pause for a moment to remember our ancestral roots and the enslaved African people that were stolen from their homelands and traveled through the transatlantic route to build on lands we know as North America. Let us honor the enslaved people who built this nation. Let us recognize the histories of Ontario and across Canada as complicit with the racism of white supremacy. We recognize that these difficult histories persist in present-day racial realities. We commit to dismantling racism in all spaces, and we invite you to come together with us to create change. Now, for those who are unfamiliar or are familiar with us, we do have different events and webinars that happen on a monthly basis. So this one is actually our last one for 2023, but there are still some programs that will be ending next week. So if you wanted to jump in, there is still the Queens Unite group. I believe that completed this week. We have our KUA program, which I believe did end this week as well, and our Fahanka family drop-in, which ends this week. We are also seeking for Black mentors to provide some mentorship to youth that are seeking guidance and support. So if you're interested in being a mentor, please email us at info@kajengafamily.org. Now let's get into more about our presenter. Nicole Bedward is a registered social worker and holds a BA in psychology and a master's degree in social work. Nicole has been serving children and families for over 20 years and is passionate about fostering change in structures that are embedded in cultural oppression and inequity. Her journey includes working in the mental health sector, child welfare sector, and now the education system as a senior social worker. While working in child welfare, Nicole spent over a decade as an active member of a committee whose mission was to address the unique needs of Black children and youth in care. After over 15 years in child welfare, Nicole made the move to the education system in hopes of addressing the many intersectional barriers that negate children and families from becoming their best selves. Nicole is also an independent clinician who provides therapy to individuals and families. She engages in opportunities to facilitate conversations about inequity that impact racialized populations through consulting with organizations with a focus on equity and inclusion. It is important to her that she acknowledges the societal barriers and practices that the people that she serves. Nicole practices from anti-Black racism or anti-racism, strengths-based, and trauma-informed lens. So again, I just want to thank Nicole for being here. We're so excited to hear more about your presentation. And please feel free to take it away.
Thank you, much appreciated, and thank you for the introduction. I am so thankful for those of you who were patient with the postponement of the first one, and I'm grateful that you're here tonight. And for those of you that might have registered following that, I'm also grateful to see you tonight as well. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that I do this right. Never ever was I a fan of Zoom, and this new Zoom update is not being my friend. I'm sure I'm sharing now, right?
Yes, most definitely.
Okay, excellent. So first and foremost, I would like to thank you for having me this evening. It is a great honor to be with you all tonight. I come to you not only with professional knowledge, but also lived experience. I'll situate myself as a Jamaican Canadian, Black, cisgendered, hetero, married woman. I have two beautiful boys who keep me on my toes always. I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, an auntie, a best friend, and someone who loves hard and tries to find balance in all that I do. My passion for equity started long before having children of my own, but really amped up when I did. I remember the first child I was told I was having a boy. I was like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to raise a Black male child? Um, and then I got pregnant again and tried to find all the reasons to think this pregnancy was different. And it really wasn't, because I was told I was having a second boy. And I had a moment, and then I realized that God knew exactly what he was doing. And he blessed me with two male, beautiful children, and also gave me the strength to endure the parenting that comes along with parenting Black boys. So with that said, I also recognize that I have the privilege, and I use the word because it is a privilege, working in structures that have been based in colonial and white supremacy culture, because in that space, I try and I do use my voice to the best of my ability towards impacting awareness and change. So it's equally important in this space that we build community as parents or as caregivers on our journey around being, looking after little ones or young folks. So just a quick couple of housekeeping things. I just mentioned being in community. I really hope that that is an opportunity for us. I know these virtual spaces are always hard to navigate. And, I see black boxes, maybe with some names or partial names, but I'm really hoping that as we go through the evening, if you have any questions or sharings or thoughts, that you're comfortable with, raising a hand, unmiking, maybe putting on a camera, and engaging, because it's through each other that we learn, right? Again, I come here with some professional knowledge and experience, but also with personal lived experience. And I'd also love to hear from all of you. So if you're familiar, we do have the chat on. As I'm presenting, I don't necessarily see the chat. And I believe we also have the Q&A on. I'm going to pause in two places and maybe check in with Tasia to see if there are any questions, because again, not necessarily wanting you to sit until the end to ask your questions. So this evening's themes, we're going to be talking a little bit about our history, because our history helps us understand our today. We're going to talk a bit about colonialism and its impact, particularly the impact on families and parenting. And that links to trauma and leads into resilience. And then we're going to look at resilient parenting and resilience in you. So I ask you this evening to think about the time you first learned you were going to become a parent or caregiver. What kind of parent did you hope to be? Okay. And if it's, I want you to kind of think about that as we go through the evening together, whether or not you want to jot it down, put it in a cell phone, but I want you to keep it in mind. When you first learned you were going to become a parent, what parent did you hope to be? And based on that question, I want you to also keep in mind what barriers you may have faced as a Black parent or as a parent of a Black child. Because as we go through this evening, you may see some common themes that weave throughout, or maybe some things that may resonate with you. I really like this quote by W.E. Du Bois. He was an American psychologist, a civil rights activist, and a prolific author. Many of you might have read books by him. One of his most notorious is The Soul of Black Folks and Black Reconstruction in America. And his work was very instrumental in challenging the prevalent views or perspectives that Black folks were sort of responsible for their own failures, right? And this is when it was a pivotal point where we started looking at systems and systemic oppression and the impact on Black bodies. The joys of technology.
Okay, I'm just gonna share.
It's just a brief video, but I think it's very impactful, her messaging. I'm wondering what, if any, impact or, has anyone seen this video before? What they might be feeling, thinking after seeing that. Is anyone willing to share? Oh, what's happening? Oh, okay.
Antoinette, she said, yes, I've seen the video before. Elle says, hi, we don't have access to speak. Would you like them to have access to their microphones?
I would love that. I would love to be able to make this fully engaging.
Okay, so I will turn on some mics if anybody wants to.
Yeah, hi, my name is Samantha, and it's the first time I'm seeing this video.
Mhm.
And I'm telling you, deep in my soul, I am shaking. Um, wow. That's all I said when after it's finished, because I honestly learned a lot just by watching that little clip
Yeah.
and realizing, yeah, it is real.
Yes. And it sounds like it was very impactful for you, and it kind of resonated in you.
Yes,
Yeah. And by I took off my, because I wasn't sure if your camera's on so I can see who I'm talking to, but it doesn't appear that it is. That's okay. And by resonating with you, sometimes I do like to give content warnings, and I probably should have given that because it can be very heavy. And this is why I ask that we're in community, because I'm sure if it resonated in you, it's likely resonated in others being in this space, in this room, right? Because as we navigate as parents, we do the best we can always, right? And we know children don't come with handbooks, but we're faced with some very protective circumstances that are triggering to us, and sometimes we don't even know why, right?
yes,
Yeah. I thank you for sharing, for unmiking and sharing with us and being in this space. I
yeah.
appreciate that.
I appreciate this space, to be honest. So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Was there anything else? I'm going to go back to sharing. We're all good. And I see, yes, someone else has seen the video before. No matter how many times I watch this video, it's so impactful because I think of myself and my own parenting, and where in those moments I was being protective and not necessarily realizing the impact that it might be having. Okay, from current slide, it is moving so slow. I apologize. Technology has not been my friend over the last couple of days. Good, good. All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about, and not next, it runs into, but race is a social context and separation of Black families and the over-policing of Black bodies and also social determinants of health. We know that there's been a very large impact of over-reporting of Black children and youth to child welfare. And one of the most glaring is the poor education outcomes for children and youth. All right. So we've all learned this concept of race. And Dr. Joy DeGroy speaks to, and not just, but speaks to race being a lie to justify a crime. And what is meant by that is that there's no such thing. In DNA, in blood, we're not separated on race. And rather what happens is that race is used as a means of subjugating folks, particularly, namely tonight, we're talking about Black folks. And that there's no evidence otherwise. It's a practice of domination, okay? And that has started from times of slavery through colonization to today. So when we talk about separation of families and we look back to, colonial times and during slavery, we know that Black families were not valued. We know that there was separation of Black families based on everything from labor ability to colorism or shadeism. And like Dr. Joy just spoke about, she spoke about even back then having those fears that our children were going to be separated from us if they seemed too good, too fit. So this is nothing that's new that we've seen. We've also seen the impact on Black families today for other reasons, like the police or the incarceration of our Black males and females. We see that through our child welfare system. We see that in so many aspects of life that for Black folks, we weren't set up to have this 2.4 family with 2.4 kids and a white picket fence. Not from day one until today. I just mentioned the over-policing of Black bodies. I can share stats tonight, but I can go in and on forever and for hours on that piece. But when you think about a system, a colonial system that initially was set up as a means through bounty hunters to capture and return escaped slaves, right? And I'm going to let that sit with you for a little bit. A system that initiated to capture and return slaves, or what I should be saying is enslaved people, language of the day was slaves, and return them. So there's no wonder why today, as we look at stats for our young Black men and women, no wonder we see such high rates, right? How do we shift as a system, shift from where we started solely searching out Black folks, and that bias doesn't trickle forward, generations, centuries forward, right? We realize through research and what is it? It's the Department of Corrections. They post a bunch of stats, and I can tell you that in 2019, nearly 1 in 5 people reported not very much confidence in the police. 46% of Black people aged 15 or older reported experiencing at least one form of discrimination in the past 5 years. So that's 1 in 2 folks. I can tell you that the Human Rights Commission speaks to, in 2020, police reported hate crimes motivated by hatred of race or ethnicity represented 62% of all crimes. We know that racial profiling is a serious thing. Actually, today in Toronto, there was supposed to be a report released. I only caught a small wind of it, but racial profiling still exists. We know that Black bodies experience harsher sentencing, and we also know that there are in existence higher rates of police brutality. So, is it a surprise when parents of Black children fear when their children go out the door? Is it a surprise that they fear if they get pulled over or stopped by the police? In terms of social determinants of health, we'll get a little bit more into education. But if we speak to access to healthcare, if you think about history, I don't know if you recall, but over the pandemic, there were like all these ads promoting, and you saw faces of Black folks saying, get your COVID shot, get your COVID shot. Black doctors, Black nurses, where typically speaking, we don't see these visualizations. We don't see that type of representation through STEM, through the medical sciences, etc. But that was a direct act because a lot of Black folks still have no confidence in the healthcare system. And if you want to take it back to the Tuskegee experiments, right? If you want to take a look at that, but really briefly, healthcare professionals were withholding treatment from Black men to track the progression of syphilis. Or our Black women of past were exposed to genital mutilation without their consent, or access to healthcare. Right here in Canada, or in our province of Ontario, yes, we do have OHIP coverage, but access to medical professionals that take the concerns of Black folks seriously is also problematic. Right? The other piece to that as well is that, there has been research around pain tolerance and believing whether or not someone's truly experiencing pain, and what that experience is for Black folks as well. Economic stability, again, if we want to look back to times, in the recent 60, I don't do math, I'm a social worker, in the recent 60 to 80 years, where it was actually illegal for Black folks to own property. There were ads placed for renters to be non-Black. Renters were able to, decline opportunities to folks based on race. And then when Black folks were able to obtain enough wealth to get property, what happens to those neighborhoods, right? What types of resources service that neighborhoods? Who moves in and who moves out? What does policing then look like in those neighborhoods? And that's all interconnected. I don't have to go into the underemployment, right? That was impactful then, but even until today. So these are all really important things to think about as we think about how we parent. And when we are parenting Black children, we will talk a little bit about sense of community further in. But even when you think about it, how community, from an Afrocentric view, how important community is. So whether or not you come from the continent or you come from an island, community has always been important in raising a child. It takes a village, right? Where the norm in North America really, again, is this 2-parent, 2.4 children, and individualism, right? And how many ways sometimes Black folks feel disconnected from their communities. And I use the plural communities because there's no such thing as the Black community. It's Black communities. This slide, I'm not going to read it out. I'm hoping it's large enough for everybody to see. But just some stats. In the Durham region, Black students, oh, no, we're not on students. My apologies. We're talking about child welfare. Child welfare. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. I get so impassioned when I talk about this stuff because in order for us to parent in a way that fosters resilience in our Black children, we have to understand some of this background, right? Some of the things behind parenting Black bodies. So Maynard refers to child welfare as slavery's afterlife. And there's like a whole big history that I'm not going to go into. But current day, recognizing that CAS has been the One Voice, One Vision, has been working to decrease some of the numbers that we were seeing. Because when you look at the population, the Black population for any particular region, there's a vast difference between that population and the population of children being investigated or put into care for our Black bodies. Okay, so that's something to be mindful of, right? How parenting or how families are judged because it's based on this, norm of what a family should look like. And that isn't Black bodies, right? Research, etc., has primarily been conducted on white families, white folks, to set this magical norm without recognition of how Black families might differ. And when there has been research specific to Black individuals or families, it comes from a deficit model, right? So there's often the looking at, well, how does this Black family become successful and live in the suburbs versus this family? Again, the deficit model and shifting blame to many Black folks. So we need to be mindful of that as well when we see numbers. And in terms of education outcomes, we know that, I put in that slide dropout in quotes because I often refer to them rather than dropout rates as pushout rates. We know that Black students are at higher rate of dropping out of high school or school, that they are less likely to go to university or college. They are more opt to being suspended or expelled or disciplined versus their non-racialized or non-Black counterparts. What we're seeing in Durham region is that Black children were 7.7 times more likely than white students to be disciplined. And I believe the study was done in my goodness, I didn't write that down. I want to say that it was 2020 or 2019, so fairly recently. In the TDSB, 42% of Black students have had at least one suspension versus only 18% of white students. Black students at only 0.4%, so 0.4%, are identified as gifted. So they're less likely to be identified as gifted than non-Black students. Okay. So I want you to keep all this in mind as we talk about how we support and how we raise successful children with the odds already stacked against them, right? Entering systems that we're not and have not and are currently not set up for their success. The last point speaks to struggling to see themselves reflected in educators in the curriculum. Again, there's some strides forward. However, there's small steps, right? And still having to have the conversation about what that representation looks like. Is it always about music and basketball versus, excellence through science, through medicine, through musical, instrumental music? What are the assumptions that are surrounded around how Black students are reflected? Is everyone with me still? Everybody good?
Yes.
Excellent. Any comments or anything in the chat before I move in here?
All those points that you just spoke about in regards to the education, honestly, I must honestly say, I have a son who's currently in high school,
Mhm.
and I can list off the ones that we're going through right now. So, right on.
Absolutely. 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 If you wanted to take a look at the document that I was referencing, so I think it was the GTA 5 that was involved in this particular research, including York University, and it's called Towards Race Equity. I can let you know at the end because it's in my reference.
Okay.
It's really interesting to take a look at. Of course, the Durham population was a lot smaller than, let's say, our Toronto population, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I particularly like this quote. Our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brain. The knowledge is typically experienced as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. And this is a quote from, you see the image of the book there, My Grandmother's Hand, or Hands, sorry, by Mencken. And this is a really good reflection of understanding trauma, right? And we may not be able to put our fingers on. So for example, driving in a police cruiser pulls behind you. I know immediately I turn down my music and I'm 10 and 2. I don't have time to think about it. I don't have time to process it, but my body automatically reacts. Have I had an incredibly negative, horrendous experience with police brutality directly? I've had experiences. Traumatic? No. But my body recognizes it as trauma. And I get that fear response. So trauma is what happens in the body, right? It either has a sense of safety or not. It's a highly protective tool, a highly effective tool, protective tool, and it gets stuck in the body until it's addressed, right? So even some of this historical pieces that we're talking about, this is sometimes and oftentimes and through community and other factors, how you start to heal when you better understand what that trauma is and what those trauma responses are. So it's usually not necessarily the trauma we're talking about from a tragic accident or an attack or something like that. What we're talking about is the trauma that we as Black-bodied individuals feel from things like microaggression, yet another term I don't like because anyone who experiences it knows it does not feel very micro, right? But repeated microaggressions from the myth of race that we just talked about, right? A concept that was created to keep a group of folks down, right? And keep them oppressed. And our body often reacts or recognizes when it's not feeling safe due to experiences like the myth of race or oppression or, okay? So trauma is not necessarily something that we can talk our bodies out of. It's not primarily emotional. So that might just be like you feel your heart racing, right? And it's not necessarily a specific event, nor is it a weakness or a flaw. So we need to keep that in mind behind, Black families, Black bodies, the stereotypes, the harms, the outcomes, so that as we move forward as caregivers or parents, we're able to sort of connect the dots. So I want to ask a really quick, are folks able to, what do you call it when you like raise the clap or send a thumbs up? What is that called again? I'm aging myself right now. I don't remember what it's called.
Emojis? I don't know. I think it's emojis. Like just send an emoji.
Okay. Oh, or what we can do is I'm going to ask a true or false question, and I want you to think about it. And if you're okay, I'm going to several true or false questions. If you're okay with it, then please unmic, share your response. Okay. So here's the statement. My caregiver or parent taught me that I had to be twice as good as my white counterparts to be successful. Is that true or false for anybody?
True.
True. Yeah. Yeah. I've taught my children that they must work twice as hard as their white peers. True or false?
True.
Yep. And I see comments coming in. Absolutely. I was raised to never question authority, including myself, my parents, caregivers, or any elder in the community. True or false?
True.
Yep. Okay. Excellent, Asia. I see that. Yep. Majority of us, that's the truth, right? And if anyone wants to share why they think parents might have taught us in that way.
Because that's the way they too was taught.
Yeah. It's been passed on through
That's
generations.
absolutely. Yeah.
And dare I say, as a protective measure. Does that make sense to folks?
Yes. Keep quiet and keep low.
Quiet and keep low, right?
Oh man.
Absolutely.
Wow. Mhm.
Absolutely.
For
Uh,
myself,
oh, someone speaking?
yes, sorry. For myself, I put false because, but I also see the trauma in it as well.
Yeah.
So for my parents growing up, you're not supposed to ask your elder questions,
Mhm.
but also the attachment with trauma, right? And family secrets that they
Yes.
also hold with it. So I feel like growing up, my my mother tried to teach us to ask more questions,
Yeah.
more as for safety and protection. So it's like yes to ask questions, but only in protection. So the trauma that she experienced kind of also passing it on. So it's like a double-edged sword at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, you can link it back to their upbringing and their parents' upbringing. And, again, how it resonates and it moves forward in all of us, right? So the next series of question, I've taught my children not to question the authority of people like teachers or other adults. True or false?
False.
Good. Okay. Excellent. So I'm hearing that you're breaking that mold.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Was that easy or difficult for you?
Easy.
Excellent. Excellent. Because a lot of folks, it's not easy, right? It's how they were raised. It was how they were brought up. And it also is still very protective. If you think about, the feelings that resonated in most of us after even George Floyd and many others before him and following him. I think of Tyree Nichols, right? So questioning authority, speaking up to authority, sometimes the fear of what that outcome might look like prevents us from saying, you have a voice, right?
Hmm.
You should and could stand up for yourself. I often speak to my children about their deficits or what they need to improve on more than I praise their strengths or successes. If anyone's vulnerable, willing to share vulnerably.
Yes, I'm guilty of that still. Yeah.
Yep. With the professional learnings, I still catch myself falling into that trap.
Yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
And that to me represents that racial trauma. And the more I understand that, the more active I can become in recognizing it, stopping, and fixing it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the responses. Again, this whole virtual world, it's always nice when we're face to face, especially when we are attempting to build a community of lived and shared experiences, even if they're not the same. I'm sure many folks can testify to some similarity in experiences. So before you see two definitions from the Oxford Dictionary that speaks to resilience. Anderson indicates that resilience is an ecological construct that suggests that more than individual capacity is necessary to positively adapt under adversity. So more so than one single person's capacity is necessary to adapt to adversity. And it also relies heavily on context, access to resources, and cultural relevance and meaning. And I think that's important to share here, because oftentimes as parents, we question ourselves, or we feel isolated or alone, or there's shame or guilt involved in parenting. And because it was taken from us, we've moved away from community. We've moved away from being able to really, truly talk about how we're feeling. Not to mention, the stigma around mental health in Black communities. So oftentimes we're sitting with this and struggling and questioning resilience and what that truly is. Right? This is just a quick slide of some of the stereotypes, some of the experiences, some of those barriers. Remember when back I asked what barriers you might face, right? And if you think about some of the stereotypes that our students are facing, right? Situations where on the play yard, white boys may be deemed as boys will be boys. But anyone want to throw out to me what phrase might be used to describe Black boys who may act out physically?
Violent or aggressive?
Yes.
A troublemaker.
Yep. Yep. And those labels, those names, yep, typical for bullies, yep. And those names, those labels, they stick with our children. Right?
It does.
Yeah.
And if they don't have a parent that helped to foster them, to let them know that that's not who they are or identify as, then they will grow up believing that and withdraw and sometimes end up in the wrong direction.
Yes. Yes, you've hit the nail right on the head. And that leads us to talking about protective factors. Right? So you just mentioned, I'm sorry, when someone's speaking, it doesn't show me who's speaking, but I just heard an example of a protective factor. Right? And I think it's fair enough to say that folks or parents or caregivers of Black children, because I recognize not everyone here may identify as Black, or I'm not sure, but if you're parenting or caregiving a Black child, right, I think there's a different level of protective factors that we often have to consider, right? So this work here, these next few slides are based on Dr. Kenneth Hardy, and I'm being mindful of time. So his initial recommendations around fostering resilience in our children is an 8-step. He calls it 8 steps. I've sort of combined it as it made sense to do for purposes of, when I'm having these conversations or doing these workshops. So the first is affirmation and acknowledgement. And I think the last speaker just kind of touched on that, right? So through affirmation and acknowledgement, we allow conversations about race to emerge. This means understanding and accepting the racism is real and has been experienced, and we're believing our child's narrative. And that leads to creating space for race. So conveying a sense of openness and curiosity, that it allows us to take a really proactive role in encouraging conversations about race. So if a child, says this has happened, and maybe they can't even identify that it was racism or that it was a microaggression, but being able to explore that and creating I hate the term safe space, but a safe space to be able to have those conversations, right? And sometimes those conversations are really hard. They're really uncomfortable. But it's so important for them to be able to have those spaces. This allows, this also is linked to the racial storytelling piece, right? So that's an invitation to share personal stories of racial experiences. It enables, your child to develop their voice and also to begin to think critically about their experiences as they're growing up as young persons of color. So I can share this example. I've ran groups with Black youth, and I remember we started talking about, experiences of racism. And the first time it happened, I was very surprised as we were talking about like the microaggressions. I was very surprised at the number of high school students that couldn't pinpoint it as such. They have normalized the racism to a point where they weren't even able to say, yeah, that was racist. How problematic is that for our youth and our children? That they're navigating spaces where they have normalized these experiences. So creating that space for race is very important for our young Black folks. That leads to validation of naming. So where we talked about affirming in the first block, validation is equally important because it is a tool that helps to lead to the next step, which is like counteracting the devaluation, right? So validation is very specific and it's very personalized. Through validation, we also help young people recognize their own strength, their uniqueness, their qualities, right? We're validating their experiences and validating them. And sometimes that means validating their responses. Yeah, that was really hard. Yes, I'm sure that, you wish you handled that differently or had a different outcome. Yeah, I'm sure you wish you might have said something different in a situation like that at the time. But what would you do differently now? The fact that we're sitting here and having this conversation, how incredible is that? What are your strengths? Identifying those strengths. And equally important is the naming. And I kind of jumped ahead in the last section, but the naming it. And I'm going to give you a very specific example after we get through these 4 blocks. But naming it for what it is also important. Naming it sometimes comes with the need, and if you're thinking about younger children, the need to affix language to it, right? I'm sure we can all relate to sometimes we just feel something and we don't quite know what it is, right? We can't quite put our finger on it. We really can't explain what we're feeling and what caused us to feel that. And we're adults. Can you imagine for our little ones or hormonal preteens or our teenagers that have been experiencing this stuff for long enough? Externalize and counteract. So this is a way of starting the healing process of the internalized devaluation that has been experienced. It helps youth understand and recognize that that level of disrespect or devaluing is not a them problem, right? It's a societal context in which they live and they navigate. And it also is a good opportunity when we see our young folks acting in counterproductive ways as a response. It's a really good opportunity to tap in here and help them recognize what is your desired outcome. And did that particular response help get you closer to that outcome? Okay, so everyone's still with me, following, we're good?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. I now have figured out how to keep my chat open as well. And the last piece there is rechanneling that rage, that anger. I added anger. Excellent, thank you. I added anger because rage may come out as bold, as physical, but anger can also be suppressed and compressed and look very different. Okay, so we often see that after accumulation of these racial injuries that our students, our children, our young folks are experiencing, and identifying that, yeah, you have all rights to be angry. So the goal is never to rid them of that anger. It's helping them rechannel it. So we've talked about already kind of tapping into their strengths, right? So being able to rechannel that anger. And some of that looks like, a BSA at school, Black Student Association at school. Some of that might look like advocacy, right? Some of that might look like blowing off steam on a basketball court. Doesn't really matter what it is for that student, but it's tapping into their strength, their child. Okay. So I will give a really quick example of how this kind of played out for me very recently. I have a child in grade 6 who has very, very infrequently required phone calls home, has, for the most part, been a model student. And this October, I started getting messages and messages. And another message about, do you want to meet? Can we meet? And do you want to meet just me and teacher or with your child present? I said, I'm dropping what I'm doing and I'll be there at 3:35 when school ends. And yes, keep him there. I would like him present. So the major complaints that this teacher has had is twofold. One is he challenges or refuses to remove his hat. And when he does remove it, moments later, he's got his hat back on. And this is a toque. It was the end of October, early November, when it was starting to get cold. The other complaint she had was he seems to be very negative when it comes to assignment and tasks that she delivers. And that led into, because he was popular and deemed as a leader, this was impacting the class because they were following with his negativity. So this is why I was called in, right? So I sit there in this meeting with my child present, and I, asked him a couple of things, made a couple of statements, but in that moment, I said to my son, first and foremost, you're not responsible for other people's behavior. You need to recognize, if you choose to be a leader, what type of leader do you need to be? Let's talk about that. She's sitting there, and she's like, maybe some of this negativity is coming from, like, does he have any difficulties with reading? Now, my child started off in Montessori school, started speaking full sentences at 18 months old, incredibly bright young man. And her hypothesis was there was a deficit in his capacity to read. This is why he challenged the books she picked, etc. So I asked her, have you had him read to you? Remember, so this is late September or early October. So September's passed, October's passed. Have you had him read to you? She says, no, actually, I haven't. So I said to my son, grab a book, any book, open a page, any page, read it to your teacher. He reads from it fluently, proper emphasis, all the things. And I look at her. She's like, oh, my apologies. Right. So we engage in this conversation about, you know, choice in the classroom, all the other things. But as I'm walking home with my son, I said, how was that meeting for you? Well, I feel like I'm always being picked on. I feel like she's always waiting for me to do something wrong. How does that make you feel? Well, it makes me feel angry. How did that meeting, like specifically things that were said in the meeting? Well, I just don't understand why she said to me, or she questioned my ability to read. And I, in that moment, said, well, I can tell you why, honey. Right? And I named it. I said, she looked at you as a young Black child from a deficit model. She did not take the time to even sit with you and perhaps ask why, have you read to her, like how basic is that, before bringing that to a parent's attention, right? So in this discussion on our way home, we did all that. We affirmed and acknowledged, we created space where he couldn't pinpoint it. We named it. We externalized by being able to talk about that really is a you thing. Like, you're not there to lead people unless you are a chosen leader. And that's when you really need to think about how are you a leader, but you're still not responsible for what they do or don't. And some of that anger, we talked about some other anger techniques. So this is an example of like how this could play out as you parent. Does that make sense? Any thoughts, questions? Okay. And just a quick check-in, because I had said I would check for Q&A. There was nothing there either, right? Because I only have the chats open. Okay, excellent. So thank you. So the other quick piece that we talk about, and it was touched on already, like when we see our children react in certain ways, not necessarily achieving the desired outcome, because some of that anger or that rage, as Dr. Kenneth Hardy calls it, is problematic. It leads to problems for them. I want to introduce this concept of traumatic retention. And this speaks to Menachem in My Grandmother's Hands, also speaks to this as, you know, how we see sometimes folks living up to stereotypes, right? So trauma in itself being protective. Sometimes we see that people in situations that almost mimic situations that trauma was experienced, sometimes they want to relive it to see it through to the end. And I know that's like a higher level kind of complex thought about it, but this is why we oftentimes see our young Black men and young Black girls making some of the choices to live up to some of these stereotypes, right? And I'm sure as parents, we've all had that conversation. Do you want to be a stereotype, right? I don't want to lose you to the prison, school to prison pipeline. I don't want to get a phone call from the police. But it's some of that traumatic retention that we hold that can lead to some of this behavior that we might be seeing. So some of the more typical ones that really, in terms of parenting, some of the most typical is around things like engagement, setting boundaries, trust, validation, honesty and humility, racial socialization. I smile when I see honesty and humility, because I would wager that, oh, I just saw a chat that, yeah, yeah, yeah. I see that, and so there's a comment. Why do they think that Black children cannot read? A VP repeated to my daughter what I said to him. After this, my child never trusted me for years. right? And you've got to kind of evaluate, like, why? What was the intent of repeating what was said? And why, again, is an assumption made that a child or a Black child can't read? And you've got to wonder, are these assumptions being made around and about other students? And is the same sort of caution being practiced across the board? Right? And I think it's very important that we are present. We are present. You know, I sit on parent council, not because I want to, not because I want to talk about fundraising, not because I want to be the only Black person at the table, but because I feel like I'm needed there. And not just for my two boys, but for every racialized child in that school currently and moving forward, especially as we see shifting in dynamics or demographics that's happening, right? People moving away from out of Toronto and schools being more diverse and more racialized, right? Thank you for that sharing. Um, so when it comes to honesty and humility, that's one of the things that I always chuckle at, because I think of my own upbringing, and I can't, I probably on one hand couldn't even count the number of times that my parent might have said, I'm sorry, or maybe I was in the wrong, or I wish that I did something differently, right? I remember being raised in a household that if I was told no, that's that. You don't ask why. You don't try to negotiate. You don't do any of that. You're told no, and that's a wrap. But can you imagine that as parents, we were showing that humility? We were able to say, you know what? I yelled at you when I shouldn't have. And I shouldn't have, not because of your behavior, but because in that moment, I was being reactive based on my own emotions. Let's talk. Or no, I don't think I'm ready for you to start, walking to the park by yourself because your friends are there. Mommy would like to be there. Why? Okay, we can talk about that. Can you imagine what we model for our kids? Can you imagine we're modeling that it's okay to ask those questions? Remember, earlier the true or false? We're modeling that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to seek clarification, and that you have a voice and your voice is valued. Right? Because if many are like me, and again, I'm aging myself, we didn't have many of those opportunities growing up. And that leads to trust. And that leads to engagement. Right? And as we see, trust leads to healthy attachment. And engagement is so key because it demonstrates that consistency. It demonstrates the opportunity to be spoken to be heard, to be a part of discussion. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about racial socialization, and time check, we are almost there. Racial socialization. So as we kind of went through the discussion, and I think when primarily I spoke to those 4 blocks that Dr. Kenneth Hardy, his philosophy, his thoughts, sometimes Black parents or parents of Black children have a hard time with having the talk and recognizing. So having the talk, having hard discussions about what it's like for Black folks to navigate spaces, again, not designed for them, where they're surveilled, where it wasn't set up for their success, all those things. And the outcomes for Black folks, a lot of parents kind of struggle with, do I or don't I? Is it protective or is it harmful? And I'm not here, even though we kind of, as we went through those 4 blocks, we kind of spoke about that. I'm not here to make that decision for you. The question that I propose that you ask yourself, by having these conversations, am I being protective or am I being harmful? Is it harmful? And with that, if we are choosing those conversations, we need to recognize that to counteract those societal contextual things, the systemic oppression, we need to also lift our children up and help them understand their beauty, their grace, their strength, and all that they have. So they're not just bogged down and weighed down by that. I can give another example of that. My son was about 4 years old and we were watching The Lion Guard. And for those who don't know who The Lion Guard is, that's a runoff off of Lion King. So Simba has his own family now. And out of the blue, just randomly, he was about 4 years old. He says to me, "Mommy, what color are hyenas?" Hyenas. And I'm like, I don't know. That's a good question. So I take out my phone, Google images of hyenas, and lo and behold, they're tannish. Well, if anyone can think about Lion Guard or Lion King, what color were those hyenas? Because I can tell you they're dark gray, blackish. You have to recognize that our children from such a young age is being indoctrinated into hating ourselves. If you think about Disney films, if you think about things that they're seeing on TV and messages they're getting from social media. So then you ask yourself, having the talk, the difficult talk, will it be protective or will it be harmful? Yeah. Yeah. And did you do that, Gloria, as a means? So talked with my daughter about racism before coming to Canada. She was only 10 at the time and had not experienced it before coming here. When you made the decision to have that conversation, what was your intent? Are you okay with sharing that with us? And in case Gloria needs a minute to respond, Samantha, absolutely agree. You know, as parents of Black children, there's so many assumptions around value in education. There's the assumption around, you know, the single Black mom, the dad in jail or gang banging or whatever that is. And whether or not these are implicit or explicit biases, they're biases that still exist. So how do we counteract that? We show up. We show up on every chance we get. And in terms of showing up, we recognize our strengths. We have so much strength and cultural wealth we might have lost touch with some of. We've gotten busy. We're making a life for our families. But we've got so much. We've got navigational wealth. We have our own lived experiences, things that we have survived, things that we have grown through, and maybe even grown from. And we continue to be resilient in spaces that were not defined for us. Right? And back to Gloria's comment, yep, to educate her and let her know what to expect. Yeah, absolutely. Single mother that has a ton load of family and cherish those family values. And being able to connect and reconnect. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And by reconnect and connect, right? These 4 pillars, when we think about spirituality. So whether it's in faith, a higher being, God, whatever that looks like for you, right? Around identity, knowing who you are, knowing your worth, instilling that in your child, and fostering relationships, right? So whether that's an intimate relationship, that's familial relationships, that's your chosen family relationship, whether that's a relationship with a service provider, right? And the active expression That is that continued communication between you and your child, you and your partner, you and your therapist, you and this group tonight. Active expression, having a voice, sharing your voice, and modeling that for your child, allowing them the opportunity to active expression. Okay, Sharon, you've got a comment.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So I'm from South Africa, and I'd always shielded basically these things of issues of color and stuff are managed. And so I've never really had the talk with my girls. I'm a mother to two princesses, 6 and 7, and I'd never really had the talk with them until we got here. And I got a wake-up call just a couple months ago. I'd always shielded them, and just basically, we don't see color, and you're just a strong, beautiful girl, and basically, we've just been using the word brown. And so one day, I went to the school, and I was wearing a doek, like just the traditional wear. And somebody in my daughter's class commented in the elders and said to her, "That is so embarrassing that your mother has to wear like African traditional stuff." And so she came home and she said, "Well, can you stop wearing that? And because then it becomes embarrassing." I said, "No, but that is us. That is who we are, and we should be proud of who we are." And that gave me such a wake-up call that I'd actually not really spoken to my girls about who we really are and basically the history behind what we're called and stuff. And for me personally, it's because I'd always been raised not to see color. And then I went to school in Texas, and then suddenly, bam, it was in my face. And then I had my own children. Then I also tried to protect them and just say, okay, you know what, because I'd experienced all this, then I'd rather, it's safer not to talk about it, or it's safer to just shield them. But having been here now, like moved to Canada, and then now seeing all of this and hearing you talk, I actually see the importance of having this talk and naming it. And it defines us. And one thing I must say, sorry, I'm just going on, but I'm a member of the Black Queens group, and it's actually strengthened me in being bold about and being, should I say, deliberate about identifying who I am, and also being able to teach my children to identify who they are and be proud of who they are.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
I love everything that you just said. And, you have to recognize to be able to give yourself grace, right? You're coming, and many parents that I speak to, like, and even, you think about that you are coming from a place that socially differs typically for your child, right? Where here, social construct and whiteness is embodied and is beautiful and can't do wrong and, right? So having that conversation before, getting here, I appreciate the importance of that, but also how do you wrap your head around, what do you mean you don't want to wear cultural gear? What do you, or dress? What do you mean that, you're embarrassed? Right? And it's being able
Right.
to hear that and understand that and being able to say, no, but this is why. And that's what we talked about, that whole communication piece, not simply you're wearing it because you gotta, right? You're building up, her identity and where she comes from. And what better way to be able to help your child or children kind of understand and think big picture, right?
Right.
Yeah. And the other piece that I heard you say about not seeing color, that's something that was really kind of like emphasized in the 80s. And not seeing color meant I'm not racist or racism doesn't exist.
Yes. Yeah.
That term has become more problematic because by not seeing color, we don't see the inequities that are faced by equity deserving folks, right? So with that said, if someone were to say, I don't see color, that means that we're all created equally. And yes, in the ideal world, wouldn't that be perfect? But in reality, it isn't the thing, right? So being able to talk about how racialization has, or one's, I don't want to say race, but say someone's, this color of one's skin might lead to certain responses, to certain outcomes. You are recognizing that oppression that exists, that inequities exists. Does that make sense for folks?
Wow. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Okay. So final slide. And I think it was Samantha who spoke, Sharon spoke. You led into this final slide perfectly, right? And number one is like number one. It's there for a reason. Take care of yourself. Our children in general don't come with handbooks. I told you that I had big feelings when I learned I was having not one, but two boys, right? I knew what I would be facing, or I expected what I might be facing. And often we confuse this word like this. I fear I'm going to be selfish if I take care of myself. I fear if I'm going to take a mental health day from work, that seems selfish. I fear that if I say to my kids right now is not a good time, that's selfish. What if I told you that that was self-care instead? And when situations come up with our young people that are struggling or have an experience, and you're just not quite sure, you don't really know how to formulate that response, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, hold on, I hear you. Mommy's having a big reaction right now, and I'm not sure what that's about. Give me a minute to sit with it. And we're going to have this conversation just now because I want to hear you. And through that, you're giving yourself grace. We don't have all the answers. And trust me, we're not going to get it right all the time. And that's okay as well. Just going to pause and go to the chat. I try to keep an eye on the chat because sometimes people have burning thoughts that I don't want to get lost. So Gloria, my daughter always tells me what happens at school, and I told her to tell me the truth, and I would always stand up for her. She could read fluently from the time she was 5. So at 12, 13, put her in spelling bee, and she did very well. Her home teacher helped her as well, and I did the same. Yeah. And my question to you, Gloria, have you always been like pretty present in your daughter's education, like communicating with the teachers, showing up for parent-teacher interviews, responding to any messages, right? Because I would like to offer that I think that you get the more support from the school, and someone had pointed out earlier, yeah, she's your only child. Yeah. And again, this is no judgment to those folks who are working multiple jobs or don't have the privilege of being able to shift time off or whatnot. Again, there are ways, like consider what your schedule is, what their schedule is. They offer you something after school and after school doesn't work. I'm sorry, after school doesn't work. What's your availability over the lunchtime? What is your prep time? What about before school starts? It's not set in stone when that meeting needs to occur. But what's important is that you're there, because educators typically respond differently to parents that are very present in their child's life. And that's number 6, being present. And that's not just present at school, but that's present when you're needed. That's present when a child says, can we talk? Right? To the best of your availability. And if not, again, timing's not always right. And to be honest, if I'm having big feelings, it's not the best time. Or sometimes maybe it is a good time because we're human too, right? Yeah, good point about asking for time to attend parent-teachers meetings. Yeah, or even a phone call. Like if you can't physically make it in, a phone call, right? Avoid seeing crises as insurmountable, right? So this is being able to, again, that whole engagement. You know, I don't know if I have any Jamaican families on the screen, but sometimes it's that playing fool for catch wise, right? It's being able to, wow, okay, yeah, this is big. All right, Samantha, right? It's where, you know, things seem so really big and you're making all these assumptions and your brain's going a mile a minute and you're thinking the worst. Pause, slow down, take a few deep breaths and start asking questions, right? Evaluate what works and what does not work, right? I hear you. I hear you. And there's nothing wrong with being vocal, right? There's a time and place for everything. There's definitely a time and place for everything. Evaluate what works and what doesn't work. So rather than doing the same old thing over and over again and it's not working, stop, pause, think about it. What are my alternatives here? I wonder what would happen if I reacted this way instead of that way. I wonder if, you know, as we're setting rules and routines and, you know, evening routines or bedtime routines or homework routines or what do you call it, chores. I wonder what would happen if I asked them, what chores would you like to do? A, B, C, D. And which ones do you hate? E, F, G, H. All right. Well, they all need to be done. We all have responsibility in the house. What if you did during the week 2 that you like and this one from your don't like list? How would that work? Whatever that looks like, right? So stopping, pausing, evaluating what works and what doesn't work. And welcoming opportunities to grow and for self-discovery. Evenings like tonight. Evenings like tonight, making the connection of maybe sometimes I might have reacted this way because maybe my young person is hanging out with the wrong crowd or making some not so good decisions because. And now that I know that, how can I support them? And of course, modeling what you want to see in your children. We can't tell them out there, for example, to question, to have a voice, but when they come to us, say your voice isn't relevant here. I'm the adult, you're the child. Right? And lastly, being in community. And whether that's family, friends, Black Queens of Durham, being in community. You don't have to go through this alone. And trust me, like I said before, there are others probably living, feeling, experiencing similar things. And that, I believe, brings me to the end of the evening. And I know we've been doing questions throughout. I particularly love this Maya Angelou quote. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I rise. I think that's an incredibly powerful quote. So I'll open the floor now if we still have time for any last minute thoughts, questions, opportunities. I will stop sharing so I can see what's happening. Everyone's still good. All's good. Did anybody have any questions? Was there anything in the Q&A? Oh, Sharon had a comment. Sharon.
Oh, that's the one where I unmuted. I'm
Okay,
good, thank you.
perfect. Thank you. And good looking out, Samantha, or whomever. I put my daughter in skating, big sister marching band. She had to live. Yep. Yeah. Keeping them busy. And that's not just to, keep, what's that saying about idle hands and trouble? That's not what it's always about, right? That's about fostering their strength, fostering their identity. Oh, thank you so very much, Samantha. I loved every minute of being here. Okay. Excellent. Well, I know it is almost 9. I'm sure everyone's tired and has little people that, might still be up because you didn't get to tuck them in yet. I thank you all for being here and sharing the space with me. I thank you, those who were able to unmic or put in the chat and share openly. I really appreciate that. At age 3, I introduced her to the library. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, we used to have dates at the library. And it was just always fantastic to see, because I have a love of learning and reading. Unfortunately, family reading time has to be a thing around here, because will they pick up a book instead of video games? Right. But yeah, like introducing, like before I even had babies, I had Chocolate Me on their shelf. I had books that were representative of Black excellence and Black beauty. Do I have future ones? Yes, I've partnered with Kajanga a few times to do series like this, and definitely available to do so in future. All right. Thank you all. Tasia, did you need to say a few words? Can I just good night, everyone? And I'll turn over to Tasia.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It was actually really amazing. Honestly, when it comes to what we go through as people, I know resilient is a word that we use like very often, but I don't think it's anything that we can deny at this point. And it just sucks that we're entering 2024 and we still have to have these conversations. Um, but as you said before, we do have many more sessions like this where we want to educate our families as best as possible with information. And we will share that in the new year. We have a lot more with different speakers. And in order for us to kind of continue these conversations, we also encourage you to kind of participate in our survey. So I actually added one to the chat. So if you have any feedback on what we could do better, or if you would like to hear from any other speakers, please just use your phone and then just go over this QR code and it will bring you to our survey. So the more feedback that we get, then the more we can help our community with more resources. So I'll just leave it up and for a while before everyone exits. And again, if you have any further questions for Nicole, please put it in the chat.
I'm seeing a request to share the name of the 2 videos. The first one was Dr. Joy DeGroy, and that was post-traumatic slave syndrome. And the second one was the assaulted sense of self by Dr. Kenneth Hardy. And I don't know, Tasia, if you've got like a list of folks that attended tonight, and that question was specific to Cheryl, if that's something that can be shared with her.
Well, since I have the links here that you sent me, I could also drop it in the chat.
Sweet. And then someone's asked for an email. I'm not sure if that is an email for Kajanga or for me. I'm not sure what that might be. So if anyone does reach out, you do have my email if if that's something you'd like to share. Okay.
And the 2 video links, they're in the chat for anyone that would like to see those videos. And I'll just leave this up for a couple more minutes before we close the session.
Oh, I just realized I responded to Gloria with my email address, but it did not go through.
Oh, it didn't?
No, it's stuck on direct message. I got to change that. Should I just put that to everyone? Anyone else in the,
If you're comfortable to, then
oh, it's,
did it go? Oh, I don't see. Oh, there we go.
okay. All right, Gloria, it's there.
So hopefully everyone has all the information. I will stop sharing screen. And that is it. Thank you so much.
Before you
Oh,
close it, I'll just put it in the chat because someone else has asked as well. Hold on.
okay.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to be presumptuous and just send it.
I know.
Uh, okay, to everyone. And it's there.